The ones tattooed behind your ribs. Danny. Jenkins. Cooper. Alvarez. This is the story of the names I carry. The ones I earned in the mud. The ones I failed in the smoke. And the one that dragged me back. Into the jungle. Into the dark. To answer a question I'm afraid to ask. What if some names aren't finished with us yet? This is the names we carry. A Vietnam War story. Chapter 1. The Letter. It came on a Tuesday, a thin envelope with government print, sitting innocently between my mother's Good Housekeeping and a Sears catalog. I knew what it was even before I picked it up. Every boy my age knew what those envelopes meant in 1968. My father was at the breakfast table, coffee mug halfway to his lips when I walked in holding it. He looked at the envelope, then back to his newspaper. The silence in our kitchen had weight. "Well," he said finally, "you gonna open it or just stand there?" My hands weren't steady. The summer heat pressed through the windows, but my fingers felt cold. I tore the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper that would change everything. "Greetings," it began. Such a friendly word for what followed. Dad finally looked up when I set the letter on the table. He'd served in Korea. Before that, his father in the Second World War. The Mitchell men always served. It wasn't something we discussed. It just was. "It's your turn," he said quietly, eyes dropping back to his newspaper. Mom came in from the garden, wiping soil from her hands. She took one look at my face, then the paper on the table. She didn't cry. Instead, she turned to the stove and started making pancakes like it was any other morning. "When?" was all she asked. 2 weeks. My voice sounded strange in my ears. Too high. Too young. Dad folded his paper with deliberate care. "Better tell that girl of yours. Sarah." God, what would I tell Sarah? We'd been talking about maybe getting engaged after I finished my apprenticeship at the machine shop. Normal plans. Future plans. "I'll drive you to the bus station when it's time," Dad said, standing up. He squeezed my shoulder as he passed, the closest thing to affection he'd shown me in years. "You'll do fine." I didn't say what I was thinking. That fine wasn't what happened to Eddie Mercer when he came back missing half his face, or to the Wilson boy who came home in a flag-draped box. The clock ticked on the kitchen wall. Mom's spatula scraped against the griddle. Life continuing in its ordinary rhythms while mine had just derailed. I stepped outside onto the porch, letter still clutched in my hand. Our street looked impossibly normal. Mrs. Hamlin watering her roses, kids riding bikes in the distance. 2 weeks left of this, 2 weeks left of normal. I wanted to run. The thought crashed into me with startling clarity. I could go north to Canada. People were doing it. Not many from our town. But you heard stories. But then I thought of my father's face, of the Mitchell men who'd gone before, of walking through town with everyone knowing I'd run. The weight of that shame felt heavier than whatever waited for me across the ocean. Sarah lived 3 blocks over in a white house with blue shutters. I walked there slowly, trying to find the right words. There weren't any. She was hanging laundry in the backyard when I arrived. Her blonde hair caught the morning sun, and for a moment I just watched her, memorizing the way she moved, the curve of her neck as she reached for a clothespin. "Michael!" Her smile faltered when she saw my face. "What's wrong?" I handed her the letter because I didn't trust my voice. She read it quickly, her fingers tightening on the paper until I thought it might tear. "Vietnam," she whispered. Not a question. "Looks that way." I tried to sound casual, like I was telling her about a new job or a fishing trip. "I report in 2 weeks." Sarah folded the letter carefully, handed it back to me. Then she wrapped her arms around my waist and pressed her face against my chest. I could feel her trembling. "I'll write every day," I promised, knowing how hollow the words sounded. She pulled back, her eyes shining with tears she was too proud to shed. "I'll be here," she said. But she didn't say she'd wait. We both noticed the difference. That night, I lay awake staring at my ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of home. Dad's snoring from down the hall, the ticking of Mom's antique clock, the distant whistle of the 10:15 freight train. I tried to imagine what was coming. Boot camp, jungle, combat. My mind conjured images borrowed from war movies and the few news reports that showed before Dad changed the channel, muttering about political theater. In the darkness, I allowed myself one moment of pure honesty. I was terrified. The next morning, I walked into town to the draft board. I could have waited for the official notice to take me, but somehow taking this step felt better. A small, futile grasp at control. The officer behind the desk looked up briefly. "Mitchell, we have you scheduled for next week's bus. Just sit tight until then." 2 weeks passed in a blur. I worked my final shifts at the machine shop, ate my mother's cooking, fished with my father at Miller's Creek, our conversation limited to bait choices and the weather. Sarah and I spent our last night together parked at Lookout Point. The same place we'd gone after prom, where I'd first told her I loved her. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? "I'll write," she promised, her fingers tracing patterns on my arm. "I might not be able to write back regular," I warned. "But I'll try." The morning I left, Dad drove me to the bus station in his Chevy pickup. Mom had packed a lunch in a paper bag, ham sandwich, apple, and cookies, like I was heading off to school. At the station, 3 other boys from town were waiting. Tommy Gaines, who'd worked summers with me at the quarry, Freddie Knox from the high school baseball team, and Ray Alvarez, whose father owned the Mexican restaurant on Main. We nodded to each other, trying to look confident. None of us spoke. Dad shook my hand formally. "Remember your training," he said, as if I'd already had some. "Keep your head down." Mom hugged me tight, pressing something into my jacket pocket. Later, I'd find it was a small Bible with my name engraved on the cover. Sarah didn't come to the station. We'd said our goodbyes the night before, both of us pretending it wasn't forever. Maybe it wouldn't be. But standing there, watching the bus pull in, forever felt very possible. The bus was filled mostly with boys like me. Some looked excited. Most looked numb. I took a window seat, watching my parents grow smaller as we pulled away. I didn't cry when I left. I thought that made me strong. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. Chapter 2, The Sandpit. They took our hair first. Next. The barber, if you could call him that, didn't look up as I sat in the chair. His clippers hummed with mechanical indifference. 18 years of growing my hair, gone in 30 seconds. "Move it, recruit!" a drill instructor barked from somewhere behind me. Fort Polk, Louisiana. Allegedly still the United States of America, though it might as well have been another planet. I'd been here less than 3 hours, and already civilian life felt like a distant memory. "You are no longer civilians," Drill Sergeant Hardin paced before our formation. "You are no longer protected by the Constitution. You are property of the United States government." Hardin was a compact man with skin like weathered leather and eyes that seemed to catalog every weakness. 3 combat tours in Korea. Silver Star recipient. The kind of man my father would respect instantly. "I am not here to be your friend," he continued. "I am here to keep you alive in Vietnam just long enough to kill some Viet Cong." We stood at attention in our new uniforms, 50 frightened boys pretending to be men. Some still had shaving nicks from their first attempts with a razor. The barracks were stark, metal bunks, footlockers, and bare walls. We learned to make our beds with hospital corners tight enough to bounce a quarter. We learned to arrange our footlockers with mathematical precision. Nights brought the sounds of muffled crying. I never saw who. No one admitted to it in the morning. Attention. Days blurred together. Up at 500. Physical training that left us gasping in the mud. Classroom instruction on weapons, tactics, first aid. Meals consumed in minutes. More training. Collapse into exhausted sleep, only to repeat it all again. "Mitchell!" Drill Sergeant Hardin's voice cut through the morning fog. "Your rifle's filthy. Drop and give me 20. My arms shook as I pushed against the earth. Around me, the platoon continued weapons maintenance, no one daring to look my way. "You think the VC will wait while you clean your weapon, boy?" Hardin knelt beside me, his voice low and dangerous. "You'll get your whole squad killed." The weight of that possibility, that my mistakes could cost lives, settled onto my shoulders, heavier than any pack. It was during land navigation training that I first noticed him. A lanky, grinning recruit who seemed unfazed by Hardin's constant barrage. Daniel Johnston. Danny to everyone who knew him for more than 5 minutes. "Compass is busted," he drawled. looking over my shoulder as we tried to find our bearings in a sprawling pine forest. "It's not the compass," I muttered, wiping sweat from my eyes. "It's the operator." Instead of taking offense, Danny laughed. "Well, operator, we're about half a click off course. Water's that way." He pointed west, contradicting my calculations completely. I followed reluctantly. 10 minutes later, we reached our checkpoint. Danny winked at me before moving on. That night in the barracks, he claimed the bunk above mine. "Hope you don't snore, Mitchell," he said, hanging upside down to look at me. "I'm a light sleeper." "How'd you know about the water?" I asked, ignoring his comment. "Grew up in the Louisiana bayou," he replied. "My old man was a hunting guide. Been reading land since I could walk." Danny was everything I wasn't: naturally confident, physically gifted, instinctively social. Where I calculated, he felt. Where I worried, he acted. "You overthink everything," he told me during a break in hand-to-hand combat training. "In a fight, thinking gets you killed." "And not thinking doesn't?" I countered. He grinned. "There's a difference between thinking and knowing. Your body can know things your brain's too slow to figure out." I didn't understand what he meant until our first live fire exercise. Moving through the course, I froze when targets popped up, my mind racing through the identification process we'd been taught. Danny flowed like water, his rifle an extension of his body. Threat assessment and response merged into a single fluid motion. "See," he said afterward. "Knowing, not thinking." Halfway through basic, they separated us into specialized training groups. Danny and I both got assigned to infantry, which surprised nobody. What did surprise me was how much I'd come to depend on his easy confidence, his uncomplicated approach to our shared ordeal. "You ever been hunting, Mitchell?" he asked one night as we polished our boots. "A few times with my dad, nothing serious." Danny nodded thoughtfully. "That's what they're training us for, you know, hunting. Just a different kind of game." I didn't respond. I'd been trying not to think about what waited after basic. The letters from home were my lifeline. Mom wrote about ordinary things: neighborhood gossip, Dad's garden, her church activities. Dad sent short notes, usually commenting on my mother's letters rather than writing his own. Sarah's letters came less frequently, each one slightly shorter than the last. Reading between the lines, I could feel her pulling away, preparing herself for possibilities neither of us wanted to name. "Dear John letter yet?" Danny asked, noticing me staring at an envelope. "No," I lied. He saw through it immediately. "Happens to everybody, man. My girl back home was engaged to my cousin 2 months after I left." "Sarah's not like that," I insisted, though the truth was I didn't know what she was like anymore. We were both changing in ways we couldn't explain to each other. Advanced individual training intensified everything. We learned to assemble and disassemble our M16s blindfolded. We practiced combat tactics in mock Vietnamese villages, complete with tunnel systems and booby traps. The average life expectancy of a new lieutenant in combat is 16 minutes, our combat instructor informed us cheerfully. "Your job is to beat the odds." At night, we studied maps of a country none of us could have located 3 months earlier. We memorized terrain features, learned basic Vietnamese phrases, practiced radio protocols. The army was systematically erasing who we had been and replacing it with who they needed us to be. And the strangest part? I was starting to welcome the transformation. "They're breaking us down to build us back up," I said to Danny during a rare quiet moment. He shrugged. "Nothing to break down if you never built it up in the first place." It was the most personal thing he'd ever said, and I didn't know how to respond. Before I could, Hardin appeared. "If you ladies are finished with your tea party, there's a 10-mile march waiting." The final test was a week-long field exercise designed to simulate combat conditions. Limited rations, no sleep, constant movement through difficult terrain. They called it the sand pit. "Remember," Hardin told us before we departed, "in Vietnam, you won't be individuals. You'll be a unit. You survive together or you die alone." The sand pit tested everything: our physical endurance, tactical knowledge, weapons proficiency, and most importantly, our ability to function as a team under extreme stress. By the third day, hallucinations were common. Men saw movements in the shadows, heard voices in the wind. I kept thinking I saw my father walking just ahead of our patrol, always turning a corner before I could reach him. "Stay with me, Mitchell," Danny whispered during a night movement. your mind's wandering. He was right. I'd nearly walked past our rally point, lost in exhaustion-induced fantasies. On the fourth day, our squad leader collapsed from dehydration. Without discussion, Danny took command, reorganizing our patrol to carry the fallen man while maintaining security. "Mitchell, point," he ordered, no longer the easygoing Bayou boy. "Anderson, Turner, Carey Johnson, I've got rear security." I moved to the front of our formation, scanning for threats as we'd been trained. For the first time, I felt the weight of responsibility for others' lives. It was terrifying and clarifying all at once. We completed the exercise with the second-best time in the company. Hardin actually nodded at us as we staggered back to base, the closest thing to approval we'd ever received. That night, as we collapsed onto our bunks for the first real sleep in a week, Danny whispered, "We might actually survive this, Mitchell." It was the first time either of us had acknowledged the possibility that we might not. Graduation day arrived with little ceremony. We stood in formation one last time as Hardin paced before us. "Most of you will be shipping out to Vietnam within the week," he said, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "Some of you won't come back. That's the reality." He paused before continuing. "But you're better prepared than I was my first tour. Remember your training. Trust your team. Write your mothers." It was as close to sentiment as Hardin would ever come. We understood what wasn't being said. As we prepared to leave for our next assignments, Danny approached me with his duffel slung over his shoulder. "Looks like we're heading to the same place," he said, holding up his orders. "1st Infantry Division. Big red one." Relief washed over me. The thought of facing what came next without Danny's steady presence had been my private fear. "Try not to get me killed," I replied, attempting his casual humor. He clapped me on the shoulder, suddenly serious. "We're gonna make it, Mitchell. Both of us." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. In the processing center, we sat among hundreds of other newly minted soldiers, waiting for transportation to our units. The reality of our situation was sinking in. We were no longer training for war. We were going to it. "You scared?" I asked Danny, the question slipping out before I could stop it. He looked at me steadily, all pretense gone. Only a fool wouldn't be. "What about all that confidence? The knowing, not thinking stuff?" Danny's smile was different now. Older somehow. "That's how you manage the fear, Mitchell. You don't let it go away. You make it work for you." As our flight was called, I realized something fundamental had changed. They'd shaved off my hair, but they had cut deeper than that. They'd reached inside and rearranged who I was. Whether that would keep me alive remained to be seen. Chapter 3. Welcome to Vietnam. The heat hit first. Not the gentle summer warmth of home, but a physical force that pressed against my skin like wet concrete. The air itself seemed to resist breathing. "Holy hell!" someone behind me muttered as we descended the aircraft steps. "It's like walking into a damn sauna." Tan Son Nhut Air Base, Republic of Vietnam, August 1966. The tarmac shimmered with heat mirages, distorting the rows of helicopters and transport planes that stretched into the distance. Danny nudged me. "Look alive, Mitchell." Reception committee at 2 o'clock. A group of soldiers was watching our arrival from the shade of a nearby hangar. Their uniforms were faded, their faces weathered. Veterans. They measured us with expressionless eyes as we formed up in ragged ranks. "Fresh meat," one called out, just loud enough to hear. A captain with a clipboard appeared, sunglasses reflecting our uncertain faces. "Welcome to Vietnam, gentlemen. I'm Captain Reynolds, your processing officer. Follow me." We shuffled after him into a corrugated metal building that amplified the heat instead of relieving it. Inside, long tables were staffed by bored clerks processing the endless stream of replacements. "Name?" a corporal asked without looking up. "Mitchell. Michael J. Private First Class. Serial number RA185467009. He stamped several forms, then handed me a stack of paperwork. "Next station." The processing took hours. Equipment issue, medical screening, security briefing. By the time we finished, night had fallen, bringing little relief from the heat. "1st Infantry Division people over here," a sergeant called. About 20 of us separated from the larger group, Danny and I among them. "You're shipping out to Lai Khe in the morning," the sergeant informed us. That's Big Red 1 territory, about 40 clicks north of Saigon. Until then, you're in transient barracks. Building C. The barracks were long, open-bay affairs with double-decker bunks and ceiling fans that stirred the hot air without cooling it. Most of us collapsed onto empty bunks without bothering to unpack. Sleep proved elusive. Strange sounds filtered through the thin walls. Distant helicopters, occasional shouts in Vietnamese, and once, what might have been gunfire. "You awake?" Danny whispered from the bunk above me. "Yeah." "Think we'll see any action tomorrow?" I hadn't considered that possibility. Somehow I'd imagined a gradual introduction to war, not immediate combat. "I doubt it," I replied. "Probably more processing, getting to know the unit." Danny's face appeared, hanging upside down from the top bunk. "Nervous?" "No," I lied. His grin flashed white in the darkness. Liar. Morning came too quickly. We loaded onto 2.5 trucks for the journey north. The convoy moved slowly through Saigon's chaotic streets, giving us our first real look at Vietnam. The city was a sensory assault, motorbikes weaving through traffic, street vendors calling out offerings, the mingled smells of cooking food, garbage, and diesel exhaust. Children ran alongside our trucks, hands outstretched for candy or cigarettes. "Don't give them anything," warned a sergeant riding shotgun. "Half of them are working for Charlie." As we left the city behind, the landscape transformed into brilliant green rice paddies, punctuated by clusters of palm trees. Water buffalo waded through flooded fields, guided by farmers in conical hats. It looked peaceful. It looked like a picture from National Geographic. It did not look like a war zone. "Beautiful country," I commented. The sergeant snorted. "Wait till you see what's hiding in all that pretty green." About an hour into the journey, the convoy slowed, then stopped. Word passed back that engineers were checking the road ahead for mines. We waited in the sweltering heat, watching the tree line with newfound wariness. "Remember what Hardin said," Danny murmured. "Everything's trying to kill you here." The convoy eventually continued, and by mid-afternoon, we arrived at Fire Base Lai Khe, home to elements of the 1st Infantry Division. The base sprawled across cleared jungle, a collection of sandbagged bunkers, command buildings, and artillery positions surrounded by concertina wire and watchtowers. "Welcome to the Big Red One, ladies," announced our escort as we disembarked. "Report to that tent for unit assignment." Danny and I exchanged glances. This was it, the moment we'd find out if we'd stay together or be separated. The assignment officer barely looked at us. "Johnston and Mitchell," he read off his clipboard. "Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry, Black Lions." He jerked his thumb toward another truck. "They're waiting." Relief washed over me. Whatever came next, I wouldn't face it alone. The truck delivered us to Charlie Company's area, a cluster of sandbagged hooches and fighting positions on the eastern perimeter of the base. A staff sergeant with a deeply tanned face and arms covered in faded tattoos met us. "I'm Sergeant Wilkins, your platoon sergeant," he said without preamble. "Drop your gear in Hooch 3 and report back here in 5. Lieutenant Walsh wants to meet the new meat." Hooch 3 was a plywood structure with a sandbagged roof and walls lined with empty ammunition crates, serving as makeshift lockers. 6 cots were arranged inside, 4 already claimed by the rumpled gear of absent occupants. "Home sweet home," Danny said, tossing his duffel onto a vacant cot. I claimed the remaining bunk and was arranging my gear when the Hooch's flimsy door swung open. A shirtless soldier with a patchy beard entered, stopping short when he saw us. "Well, suck me sideways," he drawled. "The replacements are here." 2 more soldiers followed him in. All 3 had the lean, hard look of men who'd been in country for a while. "I'm Corporal Harris," the bearded one said. "This is Rodriguez and Cooper. Looks like you boys are our new roommates." "Johnston," Danny offered. "This is Mitchell." Harris nodded. "Word of advice, don't unpack too much. We go on patrol tomorrow and Charlie Company's been taking casualties." Rodriguez, a compact Hispanic man with watchful eyes, snorted. "Way to welcome them, Harris." "Better they know now," Harris replied. "No point sugarcoating it." Cooper, the youngest of the 3, reached into his footlocker and pulled out a carton of cigarettes. "Welcome gift," he said, tossing it to Danny. "You'll start smoking if you don't already." Before we could respond, Wilkins's voice bellowed from outside. "New fish, front and center. Lieutenant Walsh was nothing like I expected. Barely older than us, with wire-rimmed glasses and a scholar's face, he looked more suited to a university classroom than a combat zone. "Mitchell and Johnston," he said, reviewing our paperwork. "Any special skills I should know about?" Danny spoke up. "I'm a fair tracker, sir. Grew up hunting in Louisiana." Walsh nodded. "Good. We need that." "Mitchell?" I hesitated. "I worked in a machine shop back home. Good with mechanical things, I guess." "Make friends with our company mechanic," Walsh advised. "Always need someone who can keep the equipment running." He set down our files. "Questions?" Danny asked what I was thinking. "When do we start operations, sir?" 0500 tomorrow, Walsh replied. "Search and destroy mission in the rubber plantation east of here. Standard patrol. Should be routine." The casual way he said it, like he was describing a training exercise rather than actual combat, made my stomach tighten. After the briefing, Wilkins took us to the supply tent where we were issued additional equipment. Flak jackets, helmets, ammunition pouches, and most importantly, ammunition for our M16s. 20 rounds per magazine, Wilkins instructed. Carry at least 10 magazines, more if you can manage the weight. The reality of our situation hit me as I loaded those magazines. Each round a potential life, theirs or mine. That evening, we ate in the company mess, powdered eggs and ham despite it being dinner time. The food was terrible, but I was too nervous to care much about taste. Harris's group adopted us, showing us around the firebase, where to shower, cold water only. The perimeter positions, the aid station. Cooper pointed out a group of men playing cards under a canvas awning. "Those guys were in the Aya Drang last year," he said with unmistakable respect. "Real hardcore. Half their company got wiped out." The veterans had a shorthand way of talking about combat that was impossible to decipher. They referred to operations by code names, locations by grid coordinates, and enemy forces by estimates of strength rather than as people. As darkness fell, the base transformed. Generators hummed to life, powering lights that created pools of harsh illumination surrounded by profound darkness. The perimeter came alive with increased vigilance, more guards, mechanical sounds of weapons being checked. Back in our hooch, Harris was field stripping his M16. "First patrol tomorrow," he said, looking up at Danny and me. "Some advice. Stay in formation, keep interval, watch your footing, and everyone's sake. Don't bunch up if we take fire." Rodriguez was writing a letter by flashlight. "Also," he added without looking up, "change your socks whenever we stop. Foot rot will mess you up faster than Charlie." Cooper just grinned. "And don't get shot." Danny laughed, breaking the tension. "That the extent of your tactical wisdom?" "Pretty much," Cooper admitted. "Been working for me so far." I tried to sleep that night, knowing I needed rest before my first patrol. But my mind raced with 1,000 questions and fears. What would combat actually be like? Would I freeze? Would I run? Would I die? Sometime past midnight, I heard Danny's voice from the neighboring cot. "Mitchell, you good?" "Yeah," I whispered. "Just thinking." "Stop it," he advised. "Get some sleep." "What if—" I started. "No what ifs," he cut me off. "Deal with tomorrow when it comes." Morning arrived with the muffled sound of movement. Soldiers preparing for patrol in near darkness. I dressed quickly, securing my equipment with hands that weren't quite steady. Outside, the company was forming up in the pre-dawn gloom. Lieutenant Walsh moved among the platoons, checking equipment and conferring with squad leaders. Sergeant Wilkins assigned us positions. Danny as point man for our squad, me in the middle of the formation. I wasn't sure if it was a vote of confidence in Danny's tracking skills or a way to keep the new guy where he could be watched. As first light crept across the sky, we moved out through the firebase's eastern gate and into the jungle beyond. The world outside the wire was immediately different. Every sense heightened, every movement deliberate. The rubber plantation appeared after an hour's march, eerily uniform rows of trees stretching into the distance, their pale trunks scarred from tapping. The ground beneath was relatively clear, making movement easier but leaving us exposed. Nothing happened for the first 2 hours. We patrolled in silence broken only by hand signals and the occasional whispered command. The heat built steadily, and soon my uniform was soaked with sweat. Then Danny raised his fist, the signal to halt. The entire patrol froze. Sergeant Wilkins moved forward to confer with him. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I saw Danny pointing to disturbed earth ahead. A moment later, Wilkins was gesturing us off the path. "Possible mine," Rodriguez whispered as he passed me. "Good catch by your buddy." The combat engineers were called forward to investigate. They worked methodically, eventually uncovering a crude pressure-triggered device. After disarming it, we continued, now moving with even greater caution. Around noon, we reached a small village nestled among the rubber trees. Women worked in gardens while children played in the dusty central area. Old men sat in the shade, watching our approach with expressionless faces. "Standard procedure," Wilkins explained as we set up a perimeter. "Search the village, check IDs, look for weapon caches or tunnels." The villagers submitted to our presence with practiced passivity. They'd done this before, probably many times. The women averted their eyes. The children stared openly. The old men watched with gazes that had seen too much of war. I was assigned to guard duty, while others searched the huts. Standing there, rifle at the ready, I felt acutely aware of the absurdity of my position. A factory worker's son from Pennsylvania, armed to the teeth in a Vietnamese village, desperately hoping nothing would happen. "Mitchell." I turned to find Harris beside me, his expression grim. "Come with me. Lieutenant wants all new guys to see this." He led me to a hut at the village edge where several soldiers were gathered around an open trapdoor in the packed earth floor. A tunnel entrance. "VC used these to move supplies, stage ambushes," Harris explained. "Whole countries honeycombed with them." Lieutenant Walsh was conferring with a radio man. He looked up as we approached. "Mitchell, good. I want you to see what we're dealing with." He gestured to the dark opening. "Tunnel complex. Runs under half the village. We found medical supplies, ammunition, evidence of recent use." I stared at the black hole, trying to imagine navigating those cramped, dark spaces. The thought made my chest tighten. "We're calling in engineers to collapse it," Walsh continued. "But I want you to understand, this is what makes this war different. The enemy isn't just in the jungle, they're under our feet. In the villages we're supposed to protect." As if to emphasize his point, a woman began wailing from a nearby hut. Two soldiers emerged, dragging a young Vietnamese man between them. "Found him hiding in a false wall," one reported. "Documents in his possession match known VC communication codes." The man's face was bloodied, his eyes wide with fear or defiance. I couldn't tell which. The woman, presumably his mother, was being restrained by another soldier as she cried out in rapid Vietnamese. "Bag him," Walsh ordered. "Battalion intelligence will want to talk to him." The casual efficiency with which the prisoner was zip-tied and hooded shocked me. This wasn't a training exercise. This was real. This was war. We departed the village an hour later, the prisoner in tow, leaving behind frightened women and silent children. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd made more enemies than allies with our visit. The return journey was tense. Everyone knew that moving with a prisoner increased our chances of ambush. Every rustle in the vegetation, every bird call, seemed to carry potential threat. We were about a kilometer from the firebase when it happened. A sharp crack echoed through the rubber trees, followed immediately by the distinctive thud of a bullet finding flesh. "Sniper!" someone shouted, and then the world dissolved into chaos. I dove for cover behind a rubber tree, my heart hammering against my ribs. More shots rang out, the invisible sniper adjusting his aim as we scattered. "Return fire," Wilkins ordered. 9 o'clock, second tree line." The platoon responded, M16s chattering as they poured rounds into the distant foliage. I raised my own rifle, finger trembling on the trigger, but held fire. I couldn't see a target, only trees and shadows. The firefight lasted less than 2 minutes. Whether hit or simply driven off, the sniper ceased firing. In the sudden silence, a voice called out, "Corpsman up! We've got a man down!" The casualty was Cooper. The bullet had caught him in the shoulder, a through and through that looked worse than it was. As the medic worked on him, Cooper actually grinned. "Guess I should have followed my own advice," he joked weakly. "Don't get shot." We fashioned a makeshift stretcher and continued toward the firebase, moving faster now with a wounded man. The prisoner, I noticed, watched the proceedings with calculating eyes. Crossing back through the wire felt like resurrection. The firebase, which had seemed so alien yesterday, now represented safety. Chapter 4. The Pause. The worst part wasn't the first patrol, or the second. It was the 20th, when the fear had dulled into routine, when the extraordinary had become mundane. After that first firefight, the small engagements is what was most dangerous. Harassing fire from unseen enemies who disappeared into the jungle before we could respond effectively. What they called contact and withdrawal. Enough to keep us alert, not enough to qualify as major combat, but enough to change us. "You're not the same tight ass who got off that plane," Harris told me one night as we sat cleaning our rifles. 3 months in country had given me a patina of veteran status, though the real old-timers still considered me new. "Thanks," I said, uncertain if it was a compliment. "Wasn't praise," Harris replied, but his tone lacked edge. "Just fact. Vietnam changes everybody. Question is what it changes you into." I thought about that as I finished reassembling my weapon. What was I becoming? The machine shop worker from Pennsylvania seemed like a character I'd read about in someone else's story. That Michael Mitchell wouldn't recognize this one. Leaner, harder, with calloused hands that no longer hesitated before squeezing a trigger. Danny had changed too, though differently. Where I had grown quieter, he'd become more talkative, spinning increasingly elaborate tales about what he'd do when he got home. A defense mechanism, Rodriguez called it. A way of reminding himself that there was a life waiting beyond the wire. "Gonna open a fishing charter business," Danny announced during a lull in a 3-day patrol near the Cambodian border. "Big boat, cold beer, rich tourists who tip well." "You don't know nothing about boats," Cooper pointed out, his shoulder long since healed. "I'll learn," Danny grinned. "How hard can it be? Float, drive, fish, drink. Beats humping through this jungle." Lieutenant Walsh, overhearing as he checked our positions, allowed himself a rare smile. "Put me down for your first charter, Johnston." "You got it, LT," Danny said. "Discount for NAM vets. Half price if you bring your own beer." These moments, the small human connections in the vast inhumanity of war, kept us functioning. They were lifelines thrown across the void separating who we had been from who we were becoming. When we rotated back to Lai Khe, there were letters waiting. My mother wrote about mundane things. Dad's garden, church activities, local gossip. My father added terse postscripts about the weather. They asked few questions, perhaps afraid of the answers. Sarah's letters had stopped coming a month earlier. Her last one explained that she'd met someone at nursing school, that she'd always care for me but couldn't ask me to understand, that she hoped I'd come home safe. I'd folded it carefully and stored it beneath my dog tags. Danny had received the same letter from his girl back in February, so he recognized the look on my face. "Her loss," he said simply, and left it at that. The truth was, I felt little beyond a distant ache. Sarah belonged to that other Michael Mitchell, the one who'd existed before Vietnam. Whatever I was now, I wasn't that boy anymore. April arrived with increased activity. Intelligence reported major NVA movements in our area of operations. Patrols were extended, ambushes set, night movements increased. We all felt the change, a tightening in the air, like the pressure drop before a storm. "Something's coming," Rodriguez murmured as we huddled around a map in the command bunker. "Big operation. Charlie's moving too many men to be routine." Walsh nodded grimly. "Battalion thinks they're planning to hit the Special Forces camp at Quan Loy. We're being deployed as blocking force." The mission briefing was unusually detailed. Our company would establish positions along a probable NVA infiltration route. If enemy forces appeared, we were to engage and hold until reinforcements arrived. Simple in theory, much less so in execution. We moved out before dawn, traveling in a convoy of APCs that dropped us at our insertion point, just as the first light broke over the eastern horizon. The terrain was mixed jungle and elephant grass, dense foliage interspersed with open areas that offered both visibility and vulnerability. "Perfect kill zone," Harris muttered as we established our positions. "Question is, for which side?" Walsh had positioned our platoon along a natural choke point, a narrow valley between two thickly forested hills. Each squad covered a different sector, with overlapping fields of fire designed to catch any force moving through the area. By mid-morning, the heat had become oppressive. Insects buzzed in clouds around our sweat-soaked faces. The jungle breathed around us, a living entity with its own rhythms and intentions. Danny was uncharacteristically quiet as he scanned the tree line through his binoculars. "See something?" I asked, crawling up beside him. "Not sure," he admitted. "Movement about 300 meters out, but could be monkeys." I peered in the direction he indicated, but saw only the gentle swaying of vegetation in the breeze. Danny had better eyes than most, a gift from his hunting days that had saved us more than once. "I'll tell Wilkins," I said, backing away from our concealed position. Sergeant Wilkins took the report seriously, dispatching Rodriguez and Cooper to establish an observation post closer to the suspected activity. The rest of us maintained our positions, watching, waiting. Hours passed in that peculiar state of hypervigilance that becomes almost meditative. Every sense strained to its limit, every nerve ending alive with potential energy. We'd learned to exist in this state, balanced on the knife edge between relaxation and reaction. The first indication came not from sight, but sound. A subtle change in the jungle's acoustic texture. The bird calls ceased. The insect buzz diminished. Nature falling silent in the presence of intruders. Wilkins noticed it too. His hand signal rippled down our line. Alert. Contact imminent. Danny's gaze met mine briefly. A wordless communication passed between us, the kind of understanding that develops only between men who have faced death together. "We've got this. Watch your sector. Stay alive." Radio discipline was absolute. Any transmission might give away our position. We waited in silence as the minutes stretched impossibly long. Then we saw them, shadowy figures moving through the elephant grass 100 meters from our position. Disciplined, using the terrain for cover, advancing in staggered formations. Not local guerrillas, but NVA regulars, well-trained and well-equipped. Wilkins held up his hand. "Hold fire. Let them enter the killing zone." My heart hammered against my ribs. Sweat trickled down my spine. Time seemed to stretch like taffy, each second an eternity of waiting. More enemy soldiers appeared, and then more. A larger force than intelligence had suggested, perhaps a full company moving through what they thought was undefended territory. When the signal finally came, our combined fire was devastating. The front ranks of NVA soldiers fell immediately, caught in the open by our carefully positioned crossfire. But they recovered quickly. Return fire erupted from a dozen positions as the enemy sought cover. Green tracers crisscrossed with our red ones in deadly geometry. The radio crackled to life. Walsh coordinating the platoons, calling in our contact. Promises of artillery support, 10 minutes out. Air support, 20 minutes. We just had to hold. The firefight intensified. RPGs began to impact near our positions, showering us with dirt and fragments. An enemy machine gun opened up from the eastern hill, forcing our left flank to seek better cover. Danny was beside me, his M16 chattering in controlled bursts. His face showed nothing but focused concentration as he acquired targets, fired, acquired again. "They're trying to flank us on the right," Harris shouted over the din. "Mitchell, Johnston, shift your fire." We pivoted, engaging the new threat, a squad of NVA soldiers attempting to work their way up a shallow draw that would bring them behind our position. The next few minutes were chaos, the disjointed fragments of combat that never fit together neatly in memory. The metallic taste of fear, the sharp crack of passing bullets, the distinct thump when a round finds flesh. Cooper went down first, a bullet catching him in the thigh as he moved between positions. Rodriguez was hit moments later, a round through his helmet that somehow left only a bloody furrow across his scalp instead of killing him outright. And still the enemy came, pressing the attack with a determination born of superior numbers and the knowledge that retreat meant certain death. "Reinforcements 5 minutes out," Walsh's voice reported over the radio. "Hold position." Easier said than done. Our right flank was crumbling under the sustained assault. If the NVA broke through there, they'd roll up our entire line. "Mitchell!" Wilkins appeared beside me, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "Take Johnston and 4 men, reinforce the right. Move." We scrambled through our own lines, keeping low as bullets snapped overhead. The designated position was a slight rise that offered good fields of fire but little cover. Nothing but fallen logs and the uneven ground itself. Harris was already there, along with 2 replacements who'd arrived just a week earlier. Their wide eyes betrayed their youth, their inexperience. "About time," Harris growled. "They're coming up that draw in waves. We stop them here or we're all dead." Danny took charge immediately, positioning us to create interlocking fields of fire. "Short bursts," he instructed the new men. "Aim for center mass. Don't waste ammunition." The attack came moments later, a dozen NVA soldiers rushing our position behind a barrage of covering fire. We met them with everything we had, our M16s on full auto despite Danny's instructions. The sheer volume of fire stopped the assault cold, bodies crumpling in the elephant grass. But there were more behind them. Always more. "Reloading!" I shouted, dropping an empty magazine and slamming a fresh one home. The second wave seemed to materialize from the very earth, erupting from hidden positions we hadn't detected. They were closer this time, close enough to see their faces, to make out individual features. One of the replacements went down screaming, clutching his stomach where an AK round had torn through him. Harris swore viciously, dragging the wounded man behind the minimal cover of a fallen tree while still firing one-handed. Danny and I maintained our position, shoulder to shoulder, our rifles growing hot from sustained fire. We'd done this dance before, the deadly choreography of combat where each man covers the other, moves when the other moves, breathes when the other breathes. Then I saw it, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. An NVA soldier had worked his way around our flank, emerging from thick vegetation not 20 meters away. His AK-47 was raised, aiming directly at Danny's exposed side. Time slowed to a crawl. I knew I should swing my rifle toward the threat, knew I should fire immediately. Every training exercise, every combat drill, every instinct screamed at me to act, but I hesitated. It was the briefest of moments, less than a heartbeat, less than a breath. A microscopic eternity where doubt froze my muscles and clouded my mind. Is that really a soldier? Is he really aiming at Danny? Am I sure? The questions flashed through my consciousness with devastating speed, paralyzing me in that crucial instant when action meant life and inaction meant death. I saw the NVA soldier's finger tighten on his trigger, saw the muzzle flash, heard the distinctive report of the AK-47. And then Danny was spinning, falling, his chest blooming red where the rounds had torn through him. My hesitation evaporated in a surge of rage and horror. I turned and emptied my magazine into the enemy soldier, watching him jerk and collapse as my rounds found their mark. But it was too late. "Man down!" I screamed, dropping to my knees beside Danny. "Medic! We need a medic here!" Blood bubbled from the corner of Danny's mouth as he gasped for air. His eyes found mine, wide with shock and something worse. Understanding. "Mitchell," he whispered, his voice a wet rasp. "You saw him." Not an accusation. A statement of fact. He knew. He'd seen me freeze. "Hang on," I pleaded, pressing my hands against the wounds in a futile attempt to stem the bleeding. "Medic's coming. Just hang on." But even as I said it, I knew. The wounds were too severe, the damage too extensive. No medic could fix what those high-velocity rounds had done to Danny's chest. He gripped my wrist with surprising strength. "Not your fault," he managed, blood flecking his lips. "Combat happens. Don't talk," I urged him. "Save your strength." A ghost of his familiar grin flickered across his face. "Tell them." I didn't feel anything. His eyes locked on mine, suddenly intense. "Promise." "I promise," I whispered. The battle continued around us. Gunfire, explosions, shouted commands. But it seemed distant, unimportant. I remained kneeling beside my friend's body, my hands still pressed uselessly against wounds that no longer bled. Harris appeared beside me, his face grim. "Mitchell! Mitchell! We have to move! Now!" I looked up at him, uncomprehending. "The position's being overrun," he snapped. "We need to fall back. Help me with him." Together we dragged Danny's body toward our lines, bullets kicking up dirt around us. But the volume was too much. Both Harris and I lost our grip but tumbled forward, losing our footing on the hill. We both turned to return to Danny, but an RPG slammed the earth around us, throwing debris into our bodies and eyes. A moment of panic overwhelmed me. I couldn't see, and an enemy was on top of us. Another moment of uncertainty swept over me. I paused for another second, hoping to regain my eyesight. But it was too late. The promised reinforcements had finally arrived. The distinct sound of Huey helicopter gunships and the rhythmic thud of a 105mm howitzer laying down supporting fire. The NVA attack faltered under the combined assault. Another soldier grabbed me up and began to return me to safety. I screamed for Danny. But the volume of rounds from the helicopters and reinforcements shook the world around us. By the time we reached the relative safety of our main position, the enemy was already withdrawing, melting back into the jungle from which they'd emerged. The aftermath was the usual mixture of frantic activity and stunned stillness. Medics worked on the wounded. Radio operators coordinated medevac helicopters. Officers assessed the damage, counted casualties, reported to higher command. I stood in rage, yelling for Danny. Danny! 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 Another soldier placed his hand over my mouth and pushed me to the ground. I sat apart, Danny's blood drying on my hands and uniform. The image of that moment, that tiny, fatal hesitation, played on endless loop in my mind. As I began to regain my sight, the field was full of reinforcements. They were beginning to gather up our dead and wounded. I stood and began to run back toward the jungle to find Danny when I was knocked back to the ground. Lieutenant Walsh leaped on top of me to hold me to the ground. I looked up to see deep into his soul, his young face aged by the day's events. He reprimanded me, ordering me to stay put. Let the reinforcements do their job. He rolled off me, sitting beside me. I sat up to see Danny's blood drying on my hands and uniform. The image of that moment, and that tiny, fatal hesitation, played on endless loop in my mind. Johnston was a good soldier, he said finally. The best, I agreed, my voice hollow. Walsh studied me carefully. What happened out there? The question hung between us. This was my moment to confess, to admit my failure, to accept responsibility for my friend's death. Enemy flanked our position, I said mechanically. Danny was hit before we could respond. Not a lie, not the complete truth either. Walsh nodded slowly, accepting my account. Write his family when we get back to base. They'll want to hear from someone who was with him. I nodded numbly, wondering what I could possibly say to Danny's parents. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Johnston, your son died because I hesitated. Because in the moment it mattered most, I froze. The letter I eventually wrote contained none of that. It spoke of Danny's courage, his skills, his popularity among the men. It mentioned that he died instantly, feeling no pain, the lie he had asked me to tell. It did not mention my role in his death. That night, lying on my cot in the now half-empty hooch, I made a decision. I would write to Danny every night for the rest of my tour. Not letters to be sent, but a record of what I couldn't bring myself to confess to anyone else. Dear Danny, I wrote in the beam of my flashlight, I'm sorry. I saw him coming. I should have fired. I don't know why I didn't. I'm sorry. It wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough. But it was a beginning. The first halting step on a long journey toward an absolution I wasn't sure I deserved. In the months that followed, I accumulated names, a growing list of the dead that began with Daniel Johnston. Some were friends, some were strangers. All were added to my private litany, a rosary of remembrance I recited in the dark hours when sleep wouldn't come. I never hesitated again. That part of me, the part capable of doubt, of questioning, had died with Danny in that nameless valley. What remained was a mechanism, a weapon system of flesh and bone that performed its function with cold efficiency. The others noticed the change. Harris watched me with wary respect. Walsh assigned me to the most difficult missions without comment. Even Wilkins, never generous with praise, nodded approvingly at my newfound aggression, my willingness to take point, to volunteer for the most dangerous assignments. None of them knew I was looking for absolution in the barrel of my rifle. Or perhaps they did, and simply recognized it as one of the many ways men cope with the unbearable. Vietnam teaches you that survival isn't always about living. Sometimes it's about finding a reason to continue when living itself has lost all meaning. For me, that reason became the names. The growing list that began with Danny and wouldn't end until I left this place. If I left this place? Each night I wrote to him, Each day, I counted the cost of my hesitation, and I never paused again. I would carry those names to live within me. Chapter 5: Dead Weight. Time in Vietnam had its own peculiar physics. Days stretched endlessly, while weeks and months compressed into a blur of patrols, firefights, and brief interludes of artificial normalcy at the base. By September, I'd been in country 7 months. It felt like 7 years, or 7 minutes, both somehow true. Danny had been dead 154 days. I knew this with precision because I'd marked each one in my journal, the cheap notebook where I wrote my nightly confessions to a ghost. Dear Danny, Rodriguez rotated home today. Big ceremony, everyone slapping his back, promising to look him up stateside. He looked happy. Scared too, though he wouldn't admit it. What's he going back to? Who is he now? I've been thinking about what you said that night about knowing versus thinking. I think I understand now. My body knows things my mind doesn't want to. Like how to tell from the sound where a mortar will land, or which rustle in the jungle means danger, and which is just wind. Is that what you meant? Or am I still missing something important? I miss your laugh, man. No one laughs here anymore. I closed the notebook and tucked it into my rucksack. Outside our hooch, the firebase hummed with its nighttime routines, generators droning, distant radios playing Armed Forces Network, occasional bursts of laughter from the NCO club. Harris appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the compound lights. Mail's in, he announced, tossing me 2 envelopes. One from my mother, her familiar handwriting promising news of home that would seem impossibly distant, like dispatches from another planet. The second bore the return address of the U.S. Army Personnel Center. I opened that one first, scanning the official language with growing disbelief. No, I muttered. Harris looked up from his own mail. What? They're promoting me. Specialist 4. He snorted. Combat promotion. You earned it. Had I? By what metric? By surviving when better men hadn't? By transforming myself into the perfect killing machine, stripped of hesitation and doubt? The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. The Army was rewarding me for the very thing I couldn't forgive myself for, becoming exactly what they'd trained me to be. I tucked both letters away. I'd read my mother's later, when I could muster the emotional energy to bridge the gulf between her world and mine. Going to the bunker, I told Harris. Night watch duty, 4 hours in a sandbagged position on the perimeter, scanning the darkness for threats. I'd volunteered for extra shifts lately. Sleep brought dreams I couldn't face. The bunker was a crude structure of timbers, sandbags, and corrugated metal. It offered a clear field of fire toward the jungle, and contained the basic necessities: a field telephone, a case of fragmentation grenades, an M60 machine gun with several belts of ammunition and a stack of illumination flares. I settled in beside Private Miller, a replacement who'd arrived after Danny's death. He was young, we were all young, but he seemed even more so, with a round face that looked like it had never needed shaving before the Army issued him a razor. Anything? I asked, adjusting my helmet. All quiet. Lieutenant says intelligence reports minimal activity in the area tonight. Intelligence reports. I'd learned to take those with several grains of salt. Intelligence hadn't predicted the force that had killed Danny, hadn't warned us about the ambush that had cost us 3 men last month, hadn't foreseen any of the real dangers we'd faced. We maintained our vigil in companionable silence. Miller was one of the few new men I could tolerate. He didn't ask questions, didn't try to draw me out with conversation about home or girls or what I planned to do after the war. He simply did his job and respected the walls I'd built around myself. The night passed slowly. Occasional flares cast their harsh light over the perimeter wire, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien terrain of sharp shadows and ghostly illumination. Each time, my eyes searched for movement, for any sign of the enemy who was always there, even when we couldn't see them. When my shift ended, I didn't return to the hooch. Instead, I made my way to the small memorial the company had erected. This had become my ritual, these private vigils when the base was at its quietest, just before dawn. I'd stand before the memorial, silently reciting the names I carried within me. Not praying. I'd left belief behind somewhere in the jungle, but remembering. Witnessing. You shouldn't torture yourself. The voice startled me. I turned to find Lieutenant Walsh standing a few paces away, his lean face gray in the pre-dawn light. Sir, Johnston, he clarified, nodding toward the memorial. It wasn't your fault. A cold sensation spread through my chest. Did he know? Had he somehow discovered the truth I'd hidden all these months? I read your report, Walsh continued. Enemy had flanking position. No way you could have spotted him earlier. Relief mingled with shame. He didn't know. He was trying to absolve me of a generic guilt, not the specific failure that haunted my nights. Yes, sir, I managed. Walsh studied me with eyes that had seen too much for their years. You're a good soldier, Mitchell. One of my best. But you're carrying too much weight. I remained silent. What could I say? That he was right? That I was drowning under the weight of names and faces and moments I couldn't change? When's your R&R? He asked, changing tactics. Haven't taken it yet, sir. He frowned. 8 months in country and no R&R? That stops now. I'm putting you on the manifest for next week. Bangkok. I started to protest but fell silent at his raised hand. That's an order, specialist, he said, emphasizing my new rank. 5 days minimum. Get drunk. Find a woman. Do whatever you need to remember you're still human. Human. The word struck me like a physical blow. Was I still human? Or had I become something else? A weapon, a machine, a monument to my own failure? Yes, sir, I said finally. Thank you. Walsh nodded, satisfied. Get some rest. Operation briefing at 0900. I watched him walk away, struck by the realization that he carried his own invisible weight, the burden of command, of sending men like me into harm's way, of writing the letters when we didn't come back. Different weights, different guilts, but weight nonetheless. The next week flew by, and before I knew it, I was in Bangkok. This place was a sensory assault after the ordered discipline of military life. Colors too bright, smells too strong, sounds too chaotic. I spent my first day wandering the streets in a daze, overwhelmed by the simple fact of civilian existence. People living ordinary lives untouched by war. I did as Walsh had suggested. Found alcohol, found women. None of it touched the core of ice that had formed within me. None of it granted the absolution I couldn't give myself. On the third day, I found a small temple tucked away from the tourist areas. I wasn't seeking spiritual guidance. That door had closed for me long ago. But something about the quiet dignity of the place, the ancient stillness at its center, drew me in. An elderly monk approached as I stood contemplating a statue of Buddha. His face was a map of wrinkles, his eyes kind but knowing. American soldier, he said in heavily accented English. Not a question. I nodded. Vietnam, he continued. Again I nodded. The monk studied me with disconcerting intensity. You carry many ghosts. Something broke inside me then. A dam holding back emotions I'd refused to acknowledge. I sank onto a stone bench, suddenly unable to support my own weight. The monk sat beside me, his presence oddly comforting despite his unsettling perception. I let someone die, I confessed, the words tasting strange after so long unspoken. I could have saved him. I hesitated. Ah, the monk said, as if I'd confirmed a suspicion. The moment between thought and action, between breath and breath. I should have fired, I insisted. I saw the threat. I just paused. The monk nodded slowly. And now you carry this moment always, a stone in your heart. Yes. You seek forgiveness, he observed. I killed the man who shot him, I said. I've killed others since. It doesn't help. The monk's eyes held infinite sadness. More death never balances the scales. This is the great illusion. What does? I asked, desperate suddenly for any wisdom this stranger might offer. What balances the scales? Nothing, he said simply. There is no balance for death. There is only learning to carry your stone with grace, to use its weight to plant your feet firmly on the earth. I wanted to reject his words, to demand a more satisfying answer. But some part of me recognized the truth in them. How? I asked. The monk placed his weathered hand over his heart. Here, he said. Your friend lives here now. Honor him by living, not by dying in spirit while your body continues. It wasn't the absolution I'd sought. It offered no easy release from guilt. But it was, perhaps, a way forward. A path that acknowledged the weight without being crushed by it. When I returned to Lai, something had shifted within me. Not healing. I wasn't naive enough to believe 5 days could heal what war had broken. But perspective, perhaps. Distance from which to view my burden. The nightly letters to Danny continued, but their tone gradually changed. Less self-flagellation, more conversation. I told him about operations, about replacements, about the changing seasons and the unchanging war. I imagined his responses, the jokes he would have made, the observations that would have cut through pretense. In October, we lost Harris to a booby trap that shredded his legs and damaged his spine. He would live, the doctors said, but would never walk again. I added his name to my mental list, not of the dead, but of the war's other casualties. The walking wounded. The forever changed. This place could be both beautiful and absolutely miserable at the same time. Endless rain that transformed the jungle into a sodden nightmare of mud, mold, and misery. Operations continued regardless. We patrolled in water up to our knees, fought in downpours so heavy we could barely see our targets, slept in hooches that leaked despite our best efforts to weatherproof them. My letters home grew shorter. The disconnect between my reality and my parents' understanding too vast to bridge with words. How could I explain what this place was doing to us? How we measured time not in days but in operations, not in weeks, but in casualties. The only thing that made sense was writing to Danny. Dear Danny, they're saying we might go home soon. Not just me, the whole division. Something about Vietnamization and troop withdrawals. Politics, I guess. I should feel something about this. Relief? Excitement? Instead, I just feel numb. What am I supposed to do in the world? Who am I supposed to be? Sometimes I think I died in that valley with you. The real me, anyway. What's left is just going through the motions. But I remember what that old monk said, about carrying the weight with grace. I'm trying, man. I'm really trying. In January 1970, the rumors solidified into fact. Elements of the 1st Infantry Division, including our battalion, would be among the first units withdrawn under President Nixon's phased reduction plan. The news spread through the company like wildfire, generating reactions that ranged from jubilation to quiet apprehension. We were going home, the magic words every soldier longed to hear. So why did they fill me with dread? Walsh found me at the memorial again, the night after the announcement. He didn't seem surprised. Still standing your private vigil, he observed. Old habits, I replied. You've done your time, Mitchell. Above and beyond. 2 Bronze Stars, Combat Infantry Badge, medals meant to recognize valor, service, sacrifice, medal and ribbon that somehow were supposed to justify or compensate for all we'd lost. What will you do when you get back? Walsh asked. The question had been circulating through the hooch, through the mess hall, through every gathering of men suddenly confronted with a future they'd stopped imagining. Most had ready answers: college, jobs, marriage, all the paused plans of interrupted lives. I don't know, I admitted. Haven't thought about it. Walsh nodded as if this confirmed something. It's harder for some, the return. Like you, sir? A faint smile touched his lips. This is my 2nd tour. Volunteered for it. I hadn't known that. Had assumed, like most of us, that officers served their time and moved on to staff positions, to careers building on their combat experience. Why? I asked before I could stop myself. Walsh's gaze drifted toward the darkened jungle beyond our wire. Because I understand this, he said simply. The rules make sense here. Kill or be killed. Protect your men. Complete the mission. I nodded toward the imaginary world we all referenced. That mythical place where people live normal lives untouched by war. Chaos, he said. Everyone pretending they're not animals. Pretending death isn't waiting. Pretending their problems matter. His words articulated the formless dread I'd been feeling. The recognition that I no longer fit in the world I'd left behind. That Vietnam had reshaped me into something incompatible with ordinary existence. So what do we do? I asked. Walsh turned to face me, his expression softening slightly. We try, Mitchell. We put one foot in front of the other. We find purpose where we can. And the wait? I asked, thinking of the monk's words. The names? We carry them, he replied, until we can't anymore. Then we find someone else who understands, who can help carry them for a while. It wasn't much of a plan, wasn't much of a future, but it was something, a flickering light in the vast darkness ahead. As our departure date approached, a strange mood settled over the company. The usual gallows humor took on an edge of desperate superstition. No one wanted to be the last man to die in a war we were leaving. Operations continued, but with a newfound caution that bordered on paranoia. Officers who had once pushed aggressively now prioritized safety. Even the most gung-ho enlisted men checked and double-checked before advancing into potentially dangerous situations. I found myself in an unexpected position, the veteran others looked to for reassurance. When had that happened? When had I transformed from the hesitant machine shop worker into the battle-hardened soldier whose calm under fire steadied those around him? The answer, of course, was in that moment of hesitation. In Danny's death. In the guilt that had driven me to embrace everything I'd once feared. Dear Danny, 10 days until we stand down. The replacements who are taking over keep asking questions. Where the VC typically set up ambushes, which villages are friendly, how to tell if the ground's been disturbed for mines. I try to tell them what I can. But how do you explain instinct? How do you explain knowing when a tree line feels wrong or when a trail's too quiet? Walsh says I should consider staying in, making the army a career. Says men with my experience will be needed to train the next generation. I don't know. The thought of doing this forever. Sometimes I think I see you around the base. Just glimpses, a familiar walk, a laugh that sounds like yours. Gone when I turn my head. Is that what it's going to be like back home? Ghosts around every corner? The final operation was meant to be simple. A show of force patrol through several hamlets in our area of operations, introducing the new units to the terrain and local population before we departed. No one expected trouble. The NVA had been quiet for weeks, seemingly content to wait for our withdrawal rather than risk casualties attacking us. We moved out at dawn, a mixed patrol of veterans and replacements. The rookies were easy to spot, their uniforms too new, their movements too mechanical, their eyes too wide as they scanned unfamiliar surroundings. I found myself walking point, setting a careful pace through the thick morning mist that clung to the jungle floor. The weight of my pack, my weapon, my responsibility, all familiar now after months in country. But there was another weight I carried, invisible and heavier than any equipment. The names, the faces, the memories. The hamlet appeared through the mist, a collection of thatched huts and small gardens, children playing, women washing clothes by a narrow stream, men tending to water buffalo, a tableau of ordinary life that had become extraordinary to my war-trained eyes. Looks quiet, Jenkins whispered beside me, his rifle ready but not aimed. Always does, I replied. We moved through the village in standard formation, the replacements studying our movements, learning the unwritten choreography of patrol. The villagers watched us with the blank expressions that revealed nothing, not hostility, not welcome, just endurance. They had seen too many soldiers, both sides, come and go. An old woman approached, bent with age but moving with surprising grace. She held out a handful of small fruits, star apples, their purple skin gleaming in the morning light. Protocol said to refuse. The possibility of poisoning, of trap, of ambush triggered under the guise of generosity, all the lessons drilled into us during training. But we were leaving. 10 more days, and we'd be gone. These people left to whatever fate awaited them in a war that seemed nowhere near its end, despite our withdrawal. I took one fruit with a nod of thanks. A small rebellion against years of suspicion. A tiny acknowledgement of shared humanity in a place that had stripped so much of it away. The patrol continued without incident. We circled back toward base as the afternoon heat intensified, the weight of humidity pressing down like a physical force. The replacements were struggling now, unused to the climate, the terrain, the constant vigilance. 2 more clicks, I told Jenkins, who'd rotate back to inform the others. Easy ground from here. The words had barely left my mouth when the world exploded. Not the familiar crack of small arms fire or even the whoosh of RPGs. This was bigger, the unmistakable signature of a command-detonated mine. Earth and debris showered down as the concussive force knocked me forward onto the trail. My training took over before conscious thought could form. I rolled to the side, seeking cover, my rifle already tracking for targets as my ears rang painfully from the blast. Screams cut through the high-pitched whine in my ears. Not the replacements. They were still too shocked to vocalize. These were cries of rage, of attack. From the vegetation on both sides of the trail, dark-clothed figures emerged, AK-47s chattering. An ambush, perfect in its simplicity, devastating in its execution. "Contact left and right," I shouted, my voice sounding distant through the ringing in my ears. "Find cover." The veterans reacted instantly, returning fire while maneuvering to defensive positions. The replacements hesitated. That fatal pause between training and combat reality that had once cost Danny his life. I saw one of them frozen in the open, his eyes wide with terror as bullets kicked up dirt around his feet. No hesitation this time. I lunged forward, tackling him into the meager shelter of a drainage ditch as rounds snapped overhead. The impact drove the breath from my lungs, but I managed to roll into firing position, squeezing off controlled bursts toward the muzzle flashes in the jungle. "Radio!" I shouted to the replacement. Carlson, his name tag read. "Call it in. We need support." To his credit, the kid responded, fumbling with the handset while I provided covering fire. Around us, the patrol had recovered from the initial shock, forming a ragged perimeter as we assessed the situation. Jenkins appeared beside me, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead, but otherwise intact. "Lieutenant's down," he reported grimly. "Took shrapnel from the mine. Wilkins is calling in dust-off." A medical evacuation under fire, among the most dangerous operations. The helicopter would be vulnerable during landing and takeoff, requiring us to secure an LZ and hold it against determined opposition. "How many?" I asked, referring to our casualties. 3 wounded, including the LT. No KIA yet. Yet. The qualifier hung between us, a grim acknowledgement of our situation. The incoming fire had slackened slightly, but hadn't ceased. The enemy was regrouping, perhaps bringing up reinforcements. "We need to move," I decided. "Can't wait for them to surround us." Jenkins nodded grimly. "Where?" I quickly assessed our options. Retreating along the trail was suicide. They'd be expecting that. Pushing forward through the ambush was equally deadly given our casualties. The only choice was to break contact laterally, move to a more defensible position where we could establish a secure LZ. That rise, I pointed to a small hill about 300 meters east of our position. High ground, less vegetation for them to use as cover. "I'll pass the word," Jenkins said, disappearing back into the perimeter to relay the plan. Moving wounded under fire required precision, courage, and luck, especially with inexperienced men making up half our force. I organized the veterans to provide covering fire, while the others prepared to transport the casualties. "On my signal," I instructed. 3 smoke grenades for concealment. "Move fast, don't stop for anything." The men nodded, faces taut with concentration. Even the replacements had settled into the cold focus that combat demands. Fear remained. Only a fool feels no fear, but it had crystallized into something useful, something that sharpened rather than paralyzed. When the signal came, chaos erupted again. But controlled chaos this time, directed chaos. Smoke billowed across the killing zone as we laid down suppressive fire. The wounded were half carried, half dragged toward the hillside as the rest of us leapfrogged in protective formation. The enemy adjusted quickly, shifting their fire toward our new movement. Rounds snapped past with their distinctive crack, close enough that I could feel the displacement of air against my face. Halfway to the hill, one of the replacements stumbled, a bullet finding his thigh. He went down with a cry that cut through the firefight's cacophony. No hesitation. No pause. I changed direction immediately, laying down covering fire as I moved toward the fallen soldier. Time compressed into a series of fragmentary impressions, the weight of my rifle against my shoulder, the acrid smell of cordite, the look of pained surprise on the young man's face as I reached him. "I got you," I told him, slinging my rifle to free my hands. "Put your arms around my neck." He was heavier than he looked, dead weight, the term suddenly taking on new meaning. I staggered under the burden but kept moving, half carrying, half dragging him toward the relative safety of the hill where the others had established a perimeter. Jenkins appeared at my side, taking some of the weight as enemy fire intensified around us. Together, we managed the last 50 meters, collapsing behind the crude sangars the others had already begun constructing from loose rocks and earth. "Dust off inbound," Wilkins reported, his voice steady despite the blood soaking his sleeve from a wound I hadn't noticed earlier. "ETA 5 minutes. 5 minutes seemed to always be the usual response. 5 minutes could be an eternity in combat. I checked my ammunition. 2 magazines remaining, plus the partial one in my rifle. Not enough for a prolonged engagement. "Conserve ammo," I ordered. "Single shots, confirmed targets only." The helicopters arrived as promised. 2 Hueys, one a dust-off medevac, the other a gunship providing cover. Their distinctive whop-whop-whop echoed across the jungle as they approached our position. The enemy, recognizing the vulnerability of the moment, increased their fire. The gunship responded immediately, its door gunners pouring devastating fire into the tree line, while its rocket pods launched with devastating effect. "Prepare the wounded," I shouted over the din. 20 seconds to touchdown." What followed was another exercise in controlled chaos, loading the casualties while maintaining a defensive perimeter. The helicopters vulnerable on the ground, the enemy fire temporarily suppressed but not eliminated. As the dust-off lifted off with its precious cargo, the gunship remained, circling protectively as we prepared to withdraw. The fight had shifted in our favor with the arrival of air support, but we weren't out of danger yet. "Mitchell!" Wilkins appeared beside me, his face ashen from blood loss. "You're in command now. Lieutenant Savakid, and I need to be on the next bird." I stared at him, the implications sinking in slowly. With Walsh and Wilkins gone, leadership fell to me, the senior specialist remaining. Not officially an officer or even an NCO, but the man with the experience, the combat time. "Understood," I said finally. "I'll get them home." Wilkins clasped my shoulder with his good hand. "I know you will." Something passed between us in that moment, an understanding that transcended rank and regulation. Then he moved toward the inbound second helicopter, leaving me to organize our withdrawal. The journey back to base was tense but uneventful. The enemy, having taken significant casualties from the gunship, chose not to pursue. We moved in tactical formation, the remaining veterans on the perimeter, the replacements in the center, everyone scanning constantly for threats. I found myself in a strange state of heightened clarity. Every sense seemed amplified, the subtle variations in jungle sounds, the changing texture of light through the canopy, the smell of vegetation and sweat and lingering cordite. I was simultaneously exhausted and more alert than I'd ever been. Responsible now not just for my own survival but for everyone's. When the firebase appeared through the trees, I felt no relief. Only a hollow acknowledgement that we'd made it this time. This patrol. This day. The debriefing was brief and clinical. I reported the ambush, the casualties, the response. Made recommendations about changing patrol routes for the remaining days before our withdrawal. The senior officers nodded, made notes, asked few questions. They were already focused on the logistics of departure, on the paperwork of war rather than its reality. That night, I sat alone in the now half-empty hooch, surrounded by the personal effects of men who might never return. Wilkins, evacuated to Japan for surgery. The replacements, transferred to the aid station with wounds of varying severity. Walsh, whose condition remained unknown. I took out my notebook, stared at the blank page. What could I tell Danny about today? About the weight of command, of responsibility? About the clarity I'd found in that moment of crisis? Dear Danny, I didn't hesitate today. When it happened, when the ambush hit, everything slowed down like before. But this time, I moved. No pause. No doubt. Is that growth, or just damage? Have I learned, or am I just broken in a different way now? They put me in charge after Walsh and Wilkins went down. Me, the guy who froze when it mattered most. Isn't that a hell of a thing? 8 days left in country. 8 days? And then what? Everyone keeps asking what I'll do when I get home. Truth is, I can't picture home anymore. Can't imagine fitting back into that life, being that person again. Maybe Walsh was right about staying in. At least here, the rules make sense. At least here, I understand the weight I'm carrying. I closed the notebook without finishing the entry. Some thoughts were too private, too raw, even for this one-sided correspondence with the dead. The next morning brought news. Walsh would survive but was being sent stateside for extensive rehabilitation. His combat days were over. Wilkins would recover as well, though his arm would never regain full function. The ambush had cost us 2 dead, replacements I'd barely known, and 7 wounded. A relatively light toll by Vietnam standards, but devastating for a unit on the verge of going home. The final days passed in a blur of administrative tasks. Equipment to be inventoried and transferred, reports to be filed, personal effects to be collected and shipped. The machinery of military withdrawal grinding inexorably forward despite the human cost. Through it all, I moved with a new sense of purpose. Not the desperate need for absolution that had driven me after Danny's death, but something quieter, more sustainable. I had found, if not peace, then at least a way to carry my burden, to plant my feet firmly on the earth, as the monk had said. On our last night at Lai Key, I made my final visit to the memorial. The boots, helmets, and rifles would remain, transferred to the unit replacing us, repurposed for new men who would add their own names to the invisible roster of the dead and wounded. I stood in silence, reciting my private litany one last time. Danny's name first, then all the others that had accumulated during my tour. Not seeking forgiveness anymore, but bearing witness. Remembering. Ready to go home, Mitchell? I turned to find Jenkins standing a respectful distance away, his young face serious in the gathering dusk. Not sure ready is the right word, I admitted. He nodded as if he understood, though he couldn't possibly. Not yet. Maybe never, if he was lucky. What will you do? He asked, echoing the question everyone seemed fixed on. I considered the standard answers: college, job, family, the expected milestones of civilian life. None seemed real. None seemed possible for the man I'd become. I'll carry what I need to carry, I said finally, and put one foot in front of the other. It wasn't much of an answer, but it was the only honest one I had. The next morning, we boarded the Freedom Bird, the chartered airliner that would take us first to Japan, then to California, then home. The men around me were subdued, caught between relief at leaving and apprehension about returning. As the plane lifted off, I looked down at the receding landscape, the jungle and rice paddies, the fire base that had been our home, the country that had changed us all irreversibly. Danny had been right that night, all those months ago. There was a difference between thinking and knowing. I'd come to Vietnam thinking I understood war, death, sacrifice. I was leaving knowing their weight, their cost, their indelible mark. That knowledge would be my burden to carry home, heavier than any rucksack, more precious than any medal. The dead weight of experience that would forever separate those who had been here from those who hadn't. The plane banked, toward home, toward the unknown future awaiting us all. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight settle into its new permanent place within me. And for the first time since that day in the valley, I didn't try to shake it off. Chapter 6. No Parade. April 1970. Oakland Army Terminal, California. The processing center hummed with the controlled chaos of military efficiency. Hundreds of returning soldiers being out-processed, decontaminated, debriefed. Forms in triplicate. Medical exams, psychological evaluations conducted with such speed and superficiality they seemed designed to overlook rather than uncover problems. Any difficulty sleeping? The doctor asked without looking up from his clipboard. No, sir, I lied. The response automatic. We all lied. Admission meant delays, meant questions, meant the possibility of psychiatric holds when all we wanted was to complete this final bureaucratic gauntlet and be done. Experiencing irritability, heightened startle response, intrusive thoughts. No, sir. The doctor glanced up briefly, his tired eyes meeting mine for a moment before returning to his form. He knew I was lying. I knew he knew. This dance of mutual deception was part of the process, the unspoken agreement to push us through the system and back into civilian life, ready or not. You're cleared, he said, stamping my paperwork. Next station is finance for your final pay, then transportation. I nodded my thanks and moved on. joining the shuffling line of men in identical uniforms with identical vacant expressions. We had left Vietnam, but Vietnam hadn't entirely left us. The final pay clerk counted out my money with practiced efficiency: separation pay, unused leave, travel allowance. More money than I'd seen at once in my life, though it seemed inadequate compensation for what had been taken from me. "Sign here," she instructed, pushing a form across the counter. "And here. Initial here." I complied mechanically, barely registering the amounts or the contractual language. None of it mattered. I was going home with an honorable discharge, awards and medal ribbons meant to signify courage, sacrifice, service. What they actually signified was less clear. "Transportation is offering flights or bus tickets to your home of record," she informed me. "Where are you headed?" "Pennsylvania," I replied, "but I'll make my own way." She raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Many of us were declining the direct route home, choosing instead a more gradual re-entry into civilian life. Time to decompress, to adjust, to learn how to be around normal people again. Outside the processing center, there were protesters. I was furious. Here we were half a world away, and the people we thought we were fighting for welcomed us home with signs and spit. MPs formed a wedge between us and them. A voice began to speak in my head, Danny's words, and before I knew it, he was guiding my feet out the door where I belonged. I was done fighting. The spring sunshine bathed the parking lot in deceptive warmth. I stood for a moment, duffel bag at my feet, suddenly directionless after months of having every minute scheduled, every movement dictated by orders and objectives. "Mitchell!" A voice behind me rang out. I turned to find Jenkins approaching, his uniform crisp, his duffel slung over one shoulder. We'd been separated during processing, but had promised to reconnect before departing. "All squared away?" I asked. He nodded. "Those protesters have some nerve," he said. "I'm heading to the airport in an hour. Flight to Chicago, then home to Iowa." He hesitated. "What about you?" "Taking some time," I said. "Thought I'd see the coast first. Never been to California before." Jenkins studied me with an understanding beyond his years. In the months since the ambush, he'd grown older in ways that had nothing to do with chronology, the accelerated aging that combat brings. "Look me up when you get settled," he said, extending his hand. "My folks have a farm outside Cedar Rapids. Plenty of work if you ever need it." I took his hand, surprised by the emotion that welled up at this simple gesture of connection. I might do that. We didn't embrace, weren't those kinds of soldiers, but the handshake lingered, communicating what words couldn't. "Take care of yourself, Jenkins. You too, Mitchell, and thanks for bringing us home." He walked away then, disappearing into the crowd of returning soldiers and waiting families. I watched him go, wondering if I would ever see him again, if any of these tenuous wartime connections would survive the transition to peace. I hefted my duffel and headed for the base exit, walking away from the military with the same purposeful stride that had carried me through jungles and rice paddies. Outside the gate, several taxis waited, drivers leaning against their vehicles with the patient resignation of men accustomed to ferrying shell-shocked soldiers. "Where to, specialist?" one asked, eyeing my combat patches and ribbons with knowing eyes. "Bus station," I decided. Greyhound. The ride passed in blessed silence, the driver intuitive enough to recognize my lack of interest in conversation. Oakland flowed past the windows, a city going about its normal business, oblivious to the thousands of changed men being processed through its military terminal, filtering back into civilian society like ghosts returning to the living. At the bus station, I purchased a ticket west, toward San Francisco, toward the Pacific, toward nowhere in particular. Just away. Away from the immediacy of homecoming, from the expectations of family and friends who couldn't possibly understand what I'd experienced, what I'd become. I remembered the day after getting my draft letter. My father's face. His eyes, his not knowing, and all his years of silence. It all made sense to me now. The bus was half empty, allowing me the luxury of a row to myself. I stowed my duffel in the overhead rack, keeping only my notebook, my letters to Danny, close at hand. The habit of writing to him had become too ingrained to abandon, a ritual that provided structure when everything else seemed chaotic. As the bus pulled away from the terminal, I opened the notebook and began what I assumed would be my final entry. "Dear Danny, it's over. Officially, anyway. Honorable discharge, medals, Final pay. Freedom. That's what they call it. Freedom bird. Freedom papers. Free at last. Doesn't feel like freedom. More like exile. From what? I'm not sure yet. I'm not going straight home. Can't face it yet. The questions, the expectations, the inevitable disappointment when they realize their son isn't the same person who left. Need some time to figure out who I am now before I try to explain it to anyone else. The processing was a joke. Any problems readjusting? They ask, while making it clear the only acceptable answer is, no sir. Check the box, move along next. 20 minutes to evaluate what will take years to unpack, if ever. No parades waiting for us, Danny. No ticker tape. No brass bands. Just paperwork and a bus ticket, and thank you for your service, from people who look away before they can see anything in our eyes. Maybe that's for the best. What would we do with a parade anyway? I stopped writing as the bus merged onto the highway. The reality of civilian life flowing past at 55 miles per hour. Normal people in normal cars going about normal business. The mundane miracle of ordinary existence that had become so foreign to me. San Francisco emerged through the coastal fog like something from a dream. The iconic bridge, the hills, the Victorian buildings climbing impossible grades. I disembarked at the terminal downtown, momentarily overwhelmed by the crush of humanity, the cacophony of urban life unregulated by military precision. For 3 days, I wandered the city like a ghost. Haight-Ashbury with its hippies and head shops, Fisherman's Wharf with its tourist traps and seafood stalls, Chinatown with its exotic scents and sounds. I observed it all with detached interest, like an anthropologist studying an unfamiliar culture. On the 4th day, I found myself at a small coffee shop near Golden Gate Park, nursing a cup that had gone cold while I stared out the window at passing pedestrians. Mind if I join you? The voice pulled me from my thoughts. I looked up to find a middle-aged man in a flannel shirt and jeans, his beard streaked with gray, his eyes carrying the distinctive 1,000-yard stare I'd learned to recognize. Free country, I replied with a shrug. He set his coffee down and extended his hand. Jim Hawkins, Korea, 51 to 53. I hesitated only briefly before taking it. Michael Mitchell, Vietnam, 69 to 70. Hawkins nodded, settling into the chair across from me. Thought so. Can spot it a mile away now? How long you been back? 4 days. Going home? I shrugged again. Eventually. Tough transition, he acknowledged, sipping his coffee. Took me 2 years before I could sleep through the night. Another 3 before I could talk about it with anyone who wasn't there. I said nothing, unsure how to respond to this unexpected candor from a stranger. Part of me wanted to end the conversation, to retreat back into the isolation I'd wrapped around myself like armor. But another part, a part I'd thought long silenced, craved the connection, the understanding that could only come from someone who'd walked a similar path. Got family waiting? Hawkins asked. Parents. No wife, no kids. He nodded thoughtfully. That's both easier and harder. No one depending on you, but no one giving you a reason to get your crap together either. The blunt assessment startled a laugh from me, the first genuine laugh I could remember in months. That's one way to put it. Only way I know, Hawkins replied with a slight smile. Direct approach. Figured you'd appreciate that, soldier to soldier. Former soldier, I corrected. No such thing, he said simply. Uniform comes off. Training stays. Experience stays. He tapped his temple. War stays. The truth of it silenced me. I looked down at my cold coffee, suddenly acutely aware of the notebook in my jacket pocket. My letters to a dead man, my private confessional. What's your plan? Hawkins asked after a moment. Don't have one, I admitted. Just existing, day by day. He studied me with knowing eyes. That works for a while, then it doesn't. What worked for you? Found purpose. He gestured vaguely toward the park. Started a veterans group. Informal thing, just guys meeting to talk. No doctors, no forms, no bureaucracy. Just men who understand. And that helped? Nothing fixes everything, but carrying it together is better than carrying it alone. The monk's words echoed in my memory, about learning to carry the weight with grace, about using it to plant my feet firmly on the earth. Perhaps this was part of what he'd meant. When do you meet? I asked, surprising myself with the question. Thursdays, 7 o'clock. Building near the VA hospital on Clement Street. He pulled a matchbook from his pocket, scribbled an address on the inside cover. Come if you want. No pressure, no commitment. I took the matchbook, tucking it into my pocket alongside the notebook. Maybe. Hawkins stood, extending his hand again. Hope to see you there, Mitchell. If not, good luck. Long road ahead. After he left, I remained at the table, turning our conversation over in my mind. The unexpected connection had cracked something open within me. A tiny fissure in the walls I'd built around my experience, my grief, my guilt. That night, in the cheap hotel room I'd rented near the bus station, I took out my notebook again. Dear Danny. Met someone today. Another vet. Korea, not Nam. Seemed to recognize something in me that I don't fully recognize myself yet. He talked about purpose, about carrying the weight together instead of alone. Invited me to some veterans group he runs. First instinct was to run the other direction. Don't want to sit in a circle talking about feelings. Don't want to revisit it all. But maybe there's something there. Been thinking about what Walsh said about finding someone who understands, who can help carry the names for a while. Maybe that's what this is. Or maybe it's just delaying the inevitable, going home, facing everyone, trying to explain what can't be explained. I keep wondering what you'd do in my place. You always had plans, always knew what came next. Even in Nam, you had that fishing charter business all mapped out, right down to the discount for vets. Me, I'm just drifting. No anchor, no destination. I paused, pen hovering above the page. For the first time since beginning these letters, I felt foolish, writing to a man who would never read them, seeking guidance from a ghost who couldn't answer. Yet the habit remained. The need to communicate, to connect, even with memory, even with absence. I miss you, man. Not just you, but who I was when you were alive. Before the hesitation, before the wait. Maybe that's what I'm really looking for out here. Not just how to go forward, but how to go back. Back to some version of myself that isn't defined by that one moment in the jungle. Thursday arrived with San Francisco's characteristic fog, transforming the city into a dreamscape of muted colors and softened edges. I spent the day walking, mile after aimless mile, as if physical motion could somehow quiet the restlessness in my mind. At 6:30, I found myself standing outside the address Hawkins had given me. A nondescript building near the VA hospital, its brick facade weathered by decades of coastal air. Through the windows, I could see men gathering in what appeared to be a community room, arranging chairs in a rough circle. I almost walked away. The prospect of entering that room, of exposing even a fragment of my experience to strangers, seemed suddenly overwhelming. What could I possibly say? How could I explain Danny, the hesitation, the names I carried? As I hesitated, that familiar fatal pause, the door opened and Hawkins emerged, lighting a cigarette on the building's steps. Wasn't sure you'd come, he said, spotting me on the sidewalk. Neither was I admitted. He took a long drag, studying me through the smoke. Still not sure, I'm guessing. I nodded, appreciating his directness. Not much for talking. Nobody is, first time. He flicked ash onto the pavement. Took me 3 meetings before I said a word. Just listened. That's allowed. The simple permission to be present without performance, to witness without participation, eased something in my chest. Maybe just for a little while. Hawkins nodded, dropping his cigarette and grinding it out with his boot. That's how it starts. Inside, a dozen men of various ages had formed their circle, some clearly from Korea, others bearing the fresher marks of Vietnam. They nodded acknowledgement as Hawkins introduced me. No probing questions, no demands for my story. Just acceptance of my presence among them. I took a seat near the door, old habits of maintaining escape routes dying hard, and prepared myself for the discomfort of forced intimacy, of therapeutic platitudes. Instead, what I witnessed over the next hour was something else entirely. Raw truth-telling without pretense or expectation. Men speaking haltingly of nightmares and flashbacks, of marriages strained or broken, of civilian jobs that seemed meaningless after the life and death clarity of war. of guilt that wouldn't fade, of memories that wouldn't dim, of weight that wouldn't lighten. No one offered solutions. No one tried to fix anyone else's pain. They simply acknowledged it, received it, held space for it. When the meeting ended, several men approached to welcome me, to invite me back the following week. No pressure, no expectation, just the door left open. Outside, Hawkins fell into step beside me as I walked toward the bus stop. "Thoughts?" he asked. "Different than I expected," I admitted. "Better or worse?" I considered the question. "Realer." He nodded, understanding the distinction. "That's what we aim for. No nonsense, no forced healing, just truth and witness." "And that's enough?" "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes it's all there is." We reached the bus stop in companionable silence. As my bus approached, Hawkins extended his hand once more. "Next week?" he asked. I took his hand, feeling the first tendrils of connection, fragile but real, extending through the isolation I'd cultivated. Maybe. It was non-committal, but we both recognized it for what it was. A door cracked open, a possibility acknowledged. 3 days later, I boarded a Greyhound bound for Pennsylvania. The wandering period had served its purpose, not healing, exactly, but preparation. Distance gained from which to approach the familiar. Perspective from which to view the past and future both. The cross-country journey provided ample time for reflection. Cities and towns and endless countryside flowed past the windows like a living map of an America I barely recognized, changed not by time, but by my altered perception. In my notebook, the letters to Danny evolved. Less confession now, more conversation. I told him about Hawkins, about the veterans group, about the slow, painful process of reimagining a future that hadn't died with him in that jungle valley. When the bus finally pulled into the small Pennsylvania town I'd left a lifetime ago, I was neither the boy who'd departed nor the hollow-eyed soldier who'd returned to Oakland. I was something in between. Damaged but not destroyed. Burdened but not broken. My parents were waiting at the station, their faces a mixture of joy and uncertainty. They had aged, my father's hair grayer, my mother's face more lined. But it was the caution in their eyes that struck me most. The awareness that they were meeting a stranger wearing their son's face. "Michael," my mother said, stepping forward hesitantly. I set down my duffel and embraced her, feeling her tears against my chest. My father stood awkwardly until I extended my hand, which he took with uncharacteristic emotion before pulling me into a brief, fierce hug. "Welcome home, son," he said, his voice rough with feeling. The drive to their house passed in stilted conversation. Superficial questions about my journey, careful avoidance of anything related to Vietnam. I answered mechanically, watching the familiar landmarks of my childhood slide past with strange detachment. My room remained unchanged, a shrine to the boy who'd left, preserved in amber by parental hope. Football trophies, model airplanes. Sarah's photograph still on the nightstand, though she belonged to a past life now. That night, after an awkward dinner of my mother's best cooking and my father's hesitant inquiries about my plans, I sat at my old desk and opened the notebook one last time. "Dear Danny, home now, whatever that means. Everything's the same, but different. Or I'm different. Probably both. My parents are trying. Too hard, maybe. Walking on eggshells around me like I might shatter. Can't blame them. They didn't get any training for this. How to welcome back someone who left as their son and returned as whatever I am now. Thinking about Hawkins and his group. Might try to find something similar here. Not ready to talk much yet, but maybe ready to listen. Also thinking about school in the fall. The GI Bill would cover it. Not sure what I'd study, but it would be a direction at least. A purpose, like Hawkins said. This will be my last letter to you, I think. Not because I'm forgetting, never that. But because it's time to start talking to the living again. Time to plant my feet firmly on this new ground. Goodbye, brother. Mitchell. I closed the notebook and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk. Not hidden, not forgotten, but set aside. A chapter completed, if not concluded. 3 months passed in the strange twilight between my old life and whatever might come next. I found work at a local garage, Simple, physical labor that required just enough concentration to quiet my mind without demanding more than I could give. My hands, once trained for weapons, now learned the intricate machinery of engines and transmissions. There was a certain peace in fixing broken things. At night, I'd sit with my parents, the three of us navigating the delicate terrain of our new relationship. They never pressed for details about Vietnam, and I offered few. But slowly, carefully, we built a new language between us. One that acknowledged the divide without trying to erase it. I found a veterans group in Pittsburgh, driving the hour each way every Thursday. Not as raw as Hawkins's gathering, but honest enough. I mostly listened, but occasionally I'd share something small, an observation, a moment, never the full weight. Each time, the burden lightened slightly, redistributed among men who understood its shape and heft. On a warm August evening, I was closing up the garage when Jenkins appeared, lean and tanned from farm work, but with the same knowing eyes I remembered from Vietnam. "Thought I'd find you here," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Your mother told me where you worked." I wiped my hands on a shop rag, genuinely pleased to see him. "Iowa get boring? Harvest is done," he replied with a shrug. "Thought I'd take a road trip, see how you were settling in before I take care of some unfinished business." The phrase struck me as odd, but I didn't press. We went for beers at a local tavern, exchanging the careful conversation of men who share a past too heavy for casual reminiscence. "Still planning on engineering school?" I asked. Jenkins took a long pull from his beer, something flickering across his face. "Maybe. Been thinking about other options lately. Sometimes you realize there are things you left undone, you know?" "What about you?" he asked, changing the subject. "Fall semester starts soon. Been thinking about it," I admitted, just not sure what direction to take. Jenkins nodded, understanding the question went deeper than academic majors. "You hear about Walsh?" The mention of our former lieutenant caught me off guard. "Not since the evac." "He's back in," Jenkins said. "Different capacity. They've got him working with returning vets at Fort Dix, transition programs, readjustment counseling. Says he can do more good there than anywhere else." He paused, studying his beer bottle. "Been hearing some interesting stories from the guys he's helping. Guys who've been through things that make our tour look like a walk in the park." Something stirred in me at this information. Not quite envy, not quite longing, but recognition of a path I hadn't considered. "Seems to have found his purpose," I said, echoing Hawkins' words. "He asked about you," Jenkins continued. "Said to tell you they're looking for men with combat experience who can relate to the new returnees. Guys who understand what it's like coming back." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, sliding it across the table. "His contact information if you're interested." I stared at the paper, not reaching for it. "I just got out." 4 months ago, Jenkins corrected. "And it's not combat. It's helping guys like us find their way back." "What makes you think I've found my way back?" Jenkins smiled slightly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The fact that you're asking that question instead of denying there's a way back at all." As we prepared to leave, Jenkins gripped my shoulder. "Take care of yourself, Mitchell. And if anyone comes asking about me in the next few weeks, just tell them I went back to Iowa for school." The request seemed strange, but I nodded. "Everything okay?" "Will be," he said. "Just might be off the grid for a while, settling some old debts." When he left the next morning, continuing his eastward journey, the paper with Walsh's information remained on my kitchen table. An open question, a possible direction. That evening, my father found me on the back porch, staring at the folded note as if it might speak. "Job offer?" he asked, settling into the chair beside me. "Something like that," I replied. "Military adjacent, working with returning veterans." He nodded slowly, digesting this. Since my return, we'd established an unspoken agreement. He wouldn't ask directly about Vietnam, and I wouldn't volunteer information that might worry him. "You thinking about taking it?" I shrugged. "Not sure yet." We sat in silence for a while, watching the summer light fade over the backyard where I'd played as a child. The war seemed simultaneously a lifetime ago and still fresh, like a wound that had closed but not fully healed. "Your grandfather came back from the Great War different," my father said suddenly. Never talked about it. Not once in all the years I knew him. I glanced at him, surprised by this disclosure. My grandfather had died when I was 10, a quiet, stoic man who'd worked the same factory job for 40 years. I knew he'd served in France, but nothing beyond that basic fact. Found his journal after he passed, my father continued, full of things he never said aloud, horrors I couldn't imagine, but also regrets. What kind of regrets? I asked, though I suspected I knew. That he never helped the men who came after. That he carried it all alone when he might have shared the weight. My father turned to face me directly. He wrote that silence was his second war, and it was the one that nearly killed him. The words hung between us. An offering, an acknowledgement, a permission I hadn't known I needed. I want to help, I said finally. But I'm not sure I'm fixed enough myself to be useful to anyone else. My father reached over, his calloused hand settling briefly on my shoulder. Maybe that's exactly what makes you qualified. 1 week turned into a month, and then 2. Danny spoke to me to move. I called the number Jenkins had left. Walsh answered on the 3rd ring, his voice instantly recognizable despite the months since I'd heard it. "Mitchell," he said when I identified myself. "Good to hear from you. Jenkins passed along my message, I take it?" "He did," I confirmed. "Said you're working with returning vets now." "That's right. Transition program at Fort Dix. Teaching the Army how to bring soldiers home properly. Not just physically, but the rest of it too." There was purpose in his voice that hadn't been there in Vietnam. Not the grim determination of survival, but something more sustainable. "We need men who've been there, Mitchell. Men who understand what they're facing." "I'm still figuring that out myself," I admitted. "Aren't we all?" Walsh replied. "That's the point. This isn't about having all the answers. It's about walking alongside someone who's on the same road, just a few steps behind." I thought about Hawkins in San Francisco, about the veterans group in Pittsburgh, about the careful journey back to the living I'd begun, about Danny and the weight I'd learned to carry. "I'd need some time," I said, "to finish some things here first." "Take what you need," Walsh said. "The position will be waiting. These boys coming home now, they deserve better than what we got. A better welcome, a better transition, a better chance. You wouldn't believe some of their stories if I told you." After hanging up, I stood by the phone, feeling the familiar weight shifting inside me, not lighter exactly, but more evenly distributed, more purposeful. Outside, dusk was falling. I stepped onto the porch, breathing in the Pennsylvania air, so different from the jungle, yet tied to it now by invisible threads of memory and experience. The war would always be part of me. That much was clear. The question was what I would do with that reality. The next morning, I took out a clean sheet of paper and began to write. Not to Danny this time, but to the living. To Walsh, accepting his offer. To Jenkins, thanking him for the connection. To Hawkins, explaining what his guidance had meant. A couple weeks went by, then a couple months, and finally, a letter to myself. Not a promise or a plan, but a permission. Permission to move forward without leaving the past behind. Permission to use what I'd carried as a foundation rather than a burden. The weight remained. It always would. But now it had purpose. To plant my feet firmly on the earth. To help others find their balance on the unsteady ground between war and peace. I folded the letters, sealed them in envelopes, and walked to the mailbox at the end of our drive. As I raised the red flag, signaling outgoing mail, a military transport plane passed overhead. A C-130 from the reserve base 30 miles away, its distinctive drone familiar yet distant now. I watched its path across the clear blue sky, feeling the simultaneous pull of two worlds, the military life I'd left behind, and the civilian future stretching before me. Not an either-or choice, I realized, but a synthesis. A third path that incorporated elements of both. The decision wasn't just about staying home or serving again. It was about finding the place where my experience could become useful, rather than merely painful. Where the weight could become foundation, rather than burden. As I walked back to the house, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Vietnam. Not happiness exactly, but possibility. The road ahead was neither straight nor clear, but for the first time since coming home, I was certain it existed. The phone was ringing when I reached the front door. Mitchell? The voice was unfamiliar, urgent. This is Colonel Harrison, Pentagon. I need to talk to you about Sergeant Jenkins. My blood went cold. What about Jenkins? He's missing, son. Last seen 3 days ago in Cambodia. Unofficially. I sank into the kitchen chair, the weight I'd learned to carry suddenly crushing again. Cambodia? But we're pulling out of... That's classified information, specialist. But there are American servicemen still operating across the border. Rescue missions. Recovery operations. A pause. Jenkins volunteered for one of them. The room spun slightly. Jenkins, who'd seemed so settled on his farm. Jenkins, who'd driven across the country just to check on me. Why are you calling me? I managed. Because you know him. You served with him. And because, another pause. We think he might have mentioned something to you about where he was going. A location. A name. Anything. I thought back to our conversation at the tavern, searching for any detail I might have missed. But there had been nothing, just talk of harvest and school, and Walsh's offer. Colonel, I don't know. Mitchell pausing mid-sentence. Danny probed his memory to when Jenkins mentioned unfinished business. There's more, Mitchell. The voice dropped lower, more urgent. The team Jenkins was with. They were investigating reports of American POWs still being held. Men who were supposed to be dead. Men whose families were told they died in action. My mouth went dry. Danny's face flashed through my mind. Not as I'd last seen him, but as he'd been alive, laughing, making plans for his fishing charter. We need someone who understands the terrain, the people. Someone Jenkins trusted enough to confide in. The colonel's voice was steel now. Someone who's been there and can help us bring our boys home. Through the kitchen window, I could see my father working in his garden, my mother hanging laundry on the line. The peaceful domestic scene I'd been learning to call home. I just got out, I said, echoing my words to Jenkins. I'm starting over. I know, Colonel Harrison said, and I wouldn't ask if there were any other choice. But Jenkins is out there, and he might not be alone. There might be others, Americans who've been written off as dead but are still alive, still waiting. The weight shifted inside me, familiar and terrible. Not the weight of my own experience this time, but the weight of possibility. That somewhere in the jungles of Cambodia, American soldiers were still fighting their own war. Still waiting for someone to bring them home. How long do I have to decide? I asked, already knowing my answer. The transport leaves Fort Bragg at 0600 tomorrow. My mind raced at the possibility, including one that I refused to consider. I never got to see Danny's body after we got separated in combat. Could he? No. I saw him. That wound was unsurvivable. I closed my eyes, seeing Jenkins' face across the tavern table, seeing Danny in that jungle clearing, seeing all the names I carried, and now the possibility that some of those names might still be breathing. When I opened them, my parents were both standing in the doorway, having heard enough to understand that their son, just returned, just beginning to heal, was about to leave again. I'll be there, I told the colonel. The line went dead. I sat holding the phone, staring at my parents' stricken faces, feeling the terrible familiarity of a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Some men come home from war. Others discover that war never really ends. It just finds new ways to call you back. And for me, I am going back for the names I carry.